afternoon, everyone, and welcome and thank you for joining us for today's webinar. And the webinar today is on Payments Reimagined, the Digital Journey, and we're joined by our guest speaker, Colin Baines, who is the Chief Commercial Officer at Zepto. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today. For me, I'm joining from the lands of the Wallumattagal people of the Eora Nation in northwest Sydney. Feel free to put in the chat the traditional owners of the land in which you join us from. On behalf of us all, I'd like to pay our respects to the elders past and present and emerging, and pass that respect on to any First Nations that are joining us today. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Alana Huffnans. I'm the New South Wales State Manager. Just before I get started, we're going to run through some housekeeping. This session is going to go for about 45 minutes with 10 minutes for Q&A at the end. We will reserve the questions till the end, so please feel free throughout the presentation to put them in the chat. If we don't have enough time for the questions, we will try and address them as a follow-up to the session. Lastly, if you're attending this webinar for CPD points, you must stay on for the duration of the webinar to obtain your points for this session. So without further delay, I'd like to introduce you to Colin Baines. As I said before, he's the Chief Commercial Officer at Zepto, and Zepto is a leading account-to-account payment technology innovator, and they pioneer the future of payments through real-time account-to-account merchant payment solutions designed for the on-demand digital. Prior to his role at Zepto, Colin's held leadership positions at the Commonwealth Bank of Australia, Zipco and PayPal. He now leads the commercial team at Zepto, driving the go-to-market strategies focused on leveraging Zepto's position as a trusted infrastructure partner, modernising enterprise business payment experience and shaping an entirely new fintech ecosystem through strategic partnerships. So thank you, Colin, and I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everybody. As we just tick over the hour for those on the Eastern Seaboard, and for those in other parts of Australia, good morning to you. It's my absolute pleasure to take up the next 45 minutes of your time and take you through our journey as Zepto and take you through what we call Payments Reimagined. A little bit about me and our organisation. There's a list there of items that I'm going to go through and I'm going to discuss with you today, but ultimately, you know, as the team has just alluded to, I've been in payments for longer than I can care to admit. Worked across many organisations in many different ways, and currently I have the absolute pleasure of leading the commercial function here at Zepto. Today I'm going to talk to you a little bit around our journey as an organisation, both our beginnings and where we started from. I'm going to move into what we do, and so around the NPP. So where was the decision to introduce the NPP to the Australian ecosystem? Why was that decision made? Then our journey as a participant in that. So the journey that Zepto went through to become a connected institution, and I'll talk a little bit around that. And then a little bit around some of the security and data requirements that are happening across the NPP. I'll change tack a little bit and talk a little bit around fraud and talk you through around, you know, what fraud and how we're staring into that as an ecosystem, and then cover it off by talking a little bit around what's next across the NPP as we stare into the next iteration of it. So there's an image on your screen of a person jumping out of an airplane. No, that is not me, and I do not jump out of airplanes. I think airplanes are made for us to stay very well seated with our seatbelts nicely fastened. But why that image is really important is it's really important to the journey of Zepto. So what most people don't realise about us is our business was actually born from a group of founders who were small business owners, and they ran a skydiving business of all things in a beautiful place called Byron Bay in Sydney. This is a true story. They were merchants at the core. They lived and breathed the payments journey, merchants trying to process payments. As they stepped into that journey, they found it really difficult to be able to process payments, receive money, and then deal with everything that's complex about it. They found payments really slow and very archaic. Over time, they then exited the Byron Bay skydiving business, and the founders then moved to actually solving one of the biggest problems that they had, which was payments. And they spun up a payments business off the back of their exit from the skydiving business. And that is where Zepto started from. The gentleman on this screen is Ian Lenny, which is one of the 4 original founders. And I think what's really lovely about our journey is we stare into fixing a problem from the perspective, of the merchant rather than fixing it from the perception or the understanding of a banker or of a payments person that just wants to solve a problem in that way. And so that solving a problem for a customer is at the core of what we do as an organization. So they founded the business on this idea of, in this question that they had in their mind was, in a modern digital economy, when everything in the world is moving at click speed, why do payments still move so slowly? Why does receiving money move so slowly? And in response, this is how the business was spun up, and at the very core of what Zepto stands for and what we do every day as a payments business. Payments is core to what we do, and we are a payments infrastructure business, which means we're not going to be a button that you see in a checkout. You're not going to log in to check out on your favorite store e-commerce facility and say, oh, there's the Zepto button. That isn't what we do. We are an infrastructure business, and when you put that into context of payments, it's pipes. We are pipes. We connect to pipes and we move money between locations, and that's what we do. And so we build our business on the fact of being an infrastructure business that's looking at delivering that that infrastructure capability at a wholesale level. We enable businesses across the country, very many that you've experienced yourself, to pay out, receive, and collect monies via the real-time payments infrastructure, otherwise known as the NPP. And we also connect payments via the legacy system, which is BECS, which is the direct entry system. So you've probably already experienced that, and I'll talk a little bit about that a bit further on. Our technology currently powers about 70 million real-time bank account payments per year for some of Australia's biggest brands across many industries. I would be very surprised if there isn't a person on this call that hasn't processed a payment via either BECS or via the NPP that we haven't touched on the way through, just through the relationships and the powering that we do. So let me change tack a little bit and talk around what is the real-time payments ecosystem in Australia for everyone's benefit, for context. So the new payments platform, where did it come from? Back in 2012, the Reserve Bank published the conclusions of a strategic review that they undertook on the innovation in the payment systems in Australia. They set out a series of strategic objectives for the Australian payment system. These included the ability for users to be able to make what they call real-time payments and send complete remittance information attached to that payment to really simplify and speed up the direct entry system that we've currently been experiencing. And the purpose of it all was to make and receive payments outside of normal business hours, not be restricted to the fact that bulk files have to go at certain times and be settled at certain times, which is currently what happens in the old direct debit or BECS, direct entry environment. The Reserve Bank invited industry and determined the most effective way to delivering on those objectives. In response, an industry committee was formed and a purpose-built payments infrastructure, the NPP, was decided to be deployed. Back in 2013, which feels like a long time ago now when I reflect, the Payment System Board welcomed the proposal and made substantial initial progress towards meeting the strategic objectives that were outlined in this paper. In 2014, 1 year later, 12 authorised deposit-taking institutions, otherwise abbreviated to ADIs, these are banks, is essentially the way to think of those, committed to funding and building the operationalisation of the NPP. And they became the founding members of what is now known as NPP Australia Limited. The new payments platform, the NPP, in Australia was then started to be built. It was finally built, finished, commissioned and launched in 2018. And the purpose of it was to facilitate data-rich, real-time payments and to help Australia's digital economy move forward from where it was into the future. What's amazingly exciting off the back of that date is more than 100 banks, credit unions, building societies, fintechs and other organisations use the platform today to support real-time payments for consumers, businesses and government agencies. The NPP infrastructure supports independent development and overlay services across the ecosystem and across many different use cases that you may or may not engage with today. There are a few pathways which are really important to how organisations can access the NPP. And these are all designed to enable as many organisations as possible from different sizes and scales to be able to reap the benefits of the NPP. The purpose of the NPP wasn't just to serve the big banks. It was to serve the market, the ecosystem. So there's three different components of it. There's becoming what they call an NPP participant. There's becoming what's called an identified institution, and there's becoming what's called a connected institution. So going back to the top, what does an NPP participant mean? It's essentially an authorized deposit taking institution. This is what banks do. This is the pathway that banks take to come onto the NPP. It means that they're able to both initiate a payment upstream, but also clear and settle downstream. And there's 14 participants that are currently are known as NPP participants. What's called an identified institution, they're a little bit different in the sense that they're not an ADI, so they can't clear and settle, but they're able to offer customers NPP-enabled payments and products. They're still able to access it, but they do that via an arrangement with a directly connected NPP full participant. So, for example, via a bank that has a direct connection into the NPP. So organisations can access the NPP via that path. Or there's the last one, which is a connected institution. And that is able to be directly connected to the NPP to initiate payments, but they're not directly processing or clearing those payments. So they're still clearing and settling through an NPP participant, but they're directly connected upstream to the ecosystem. And that's what we are at Zepto, where we're a connected institution. So we're a CI in that context. When we think about the NPP platform, it's essentially what we'd like to call in payments a distributed switch. It's a bunch of individual payment access gateways that route and exchange information between other payment providers and via an ecosystem. And these are all directly linked to two things. It's a BSB and an account number, and that helps route the transaction via the NPP. So when we're pushing out a message across the NPP ecosystem, it's the BSB and account number that's being able to identify where that message goes and which bank or institution needs to receive that message. Or another way we can do it is via what's commonly known as a pay ID, so a phone number or an email address, which is linked to a BSB or account number. What's really important about the NPP is it's a platform that's open 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. And that is very different to the BECS processing platform. The Fast Payment Service, otherwise known as the FSS, is provided by the Reserve Bank of Australia, and this world-leading capability enables a single payment made on the platform, regardless of its size, to be settled in real time. And so it was a agreed complementary factor of the NPP that not only did the payments need to be able to be processed and received, so the instructions in real time, 24/7, but also the settlement of funds needed to be routed and settled in real time as well. And so that was another really key component when we looked at when they looked at the initial design of the NPP. I thought what would be really useful is to show a visual representation of how a payment works on the NPP. So I'm going to bring that up now and let you walk through and follow the arrows. Hopefully the technology works. It does. And so what you're seeing here on one side is a customer on the left and a customer on the right. It's showing an NPP participant, which is a payment gateway or a bank, and the orange is showing payments, the instruction coming in, and the green is showing the monies moving out. And so it's showing the different interoperability that happens across the ecosystem as payments move. It'll just keep rotating it. So you're seeing on the left-hand side, customers putting it in, NPP participants being pinged. They're paying by Pay ID, so it's going up to the addressing service, which is Pay ID. It's saying, are these details correct? Yes. It goes back to the participant, who then pushes out a notification settlement request to a participant on the other side. It's going via the fast settlement service, which is the Reserve Bank in the bottom, and then the funds are being clear and settled. So it's a different list here of different products it's showing and how this moves, but essentially the movement of the money and the way that it's working is very similar across the different products that operate on the NPP. One component I think that's really worth talking around is around safety and security. With the immediacy of the NPP, meaning that money's moving at real time, there is an element that needs further work across the NPP on liability and fraud. And I'm going to talk a little bit more around that a little bit further on today. We have seen a little bit around cybersecurity and risk across the NPP, and it has been I would say there has been some challenges around fraud on the platform, but it is nowhere near at a stage that is of major concern across the platform. It's all very manageable in relation to what you would expect to see across payment methods and similar to what you see across cards. See if I can move off this page for me. Beautiful. Just changing tack a little bit, I thought it'd be really useful to talk around some of the payments trends we're seeing in the Australian marketplace. And this has been really key when you look at the change from traditional payment methods, and I'm looking at credit cards as a more traditional payment method, and cash, and where that consumer behaviour has started to shift across the Australian market. On the right, on my right, there is a table there that looks at transactions per capita across different methods of payment. Some really important points to note there. The fall of cash, no surprises when you look back at 2007, cash was, the most highly used form of payment. We've seen cash continually drop off. Certainly through the back end of COVID, we saw a little resurgence of cash, but nowhere near to a point where it's challenged any of the what you will call new traditional mainstream forms of payment. Credit cards have continually been flat, growing slowly or flat across the last 5 years. And that's really off the back of what we saw through the GFC. When we went through the GFC, a lot of consumers moved away from credit and moved to spending their own money, and hence the rise of debit cards. And you look at that spike of debit cards from kind of 2011 to where it is today. A couple of blips there across 2019 and onwards during the COVID era, but debit cards are by far the most preferred way to pay. The challenges we're seeing across the ecosystem, and certainly it's been very topical of late, is around surcharging being passed on to us as consumers, especially for debit transactions, where essentially you're using your own money on a scheme rail. That is certainly a topic for conversation and not one I'm staring into today. But one that's really interesting is the rise of the NPP transactions. You can see there from 2019, it continually does grow, and it's showing good performance in relation to where it's available across the ecosystem. Direct debit and direct transfers is directly related to the BECS ecosystem, which is the traditional direct entry ecosystem. And you can see that that has been flat for a number of years now and continues to start to fall down as we're moving more towards those payments shifting over to the NPP. So what does being a connected institution mean? A connected institution is a really nice term. It's a very difficult and complex approach that Zepto just tried to take, and we did take and successfully execute as an organisation. When we stared into becoming a connected institution, for us, it was all about living our purpose, which was to be an infrastructure partner. You can't be infrastructure if you are one step away from that piece of infrastructure. So we stared into being directly connected to the ecosystem. We were the first non-bank to directly connect to the NPP, and we're also what you classify as an AusPayNet Tier 2 processor for BECS. So we're directly connected in regard to both those pieces of ecosystem. It gives us better control and flexibility and enables us to deliver more to our merchants and consumers, more around what we're able to deliver on the experience side, the messaging side, and also it gives us a seat at the table at all of the senior operating committee groups across the NPP and across BECS, as we are a connected institution. So we sit on those same operating groups as the banks. So we are able to stare right into those conversations and talk around how do we improve that ecosystem for all. And certainly it's great for us to be able to punch above our weight there from a fintech perspective. As we were the first pay tech to be approved on AusPayNet, we're also the first, and I mentioned before, we're also the first non-bank to be directly connected as a CI. It was a significant achievement. That sentence is really easy to say, but it was so difficult to be able to do that. You have to have physical servers that you are basically plugging directly into the Reserve Bank. Those servers need to be at a certain grade. You need to be able to uplift your capabilities as an organisation, both from a risk, compliance and ISO perspective, and I'm going to touch on that in a little bit, but just meeting the technical connectivity and security requirements to connect to the NPP was a huge undertaking for the organisation. Getting the green light from Swift to plug those to be able to do that and basically get the servers built, and it was not an easy undertaking for our organisation, but one I'm pleased to say that we've successfully completed and that we are directly connected, which is great. For merchants to our APIs, it opens a world of flexibility from them. So basically the way to think about what it gives our merchants is whatever Lego bricks they want to be able to add from an A to A perspective, the way they want to present the account-to-account services to their customers, but us being directly connected enables them to be able to assemble those in the way that they want to drive the experiences that they want to. And being able to leverage our solutions, merchants can take things to another level. And that's why we're so successful in the market in what we do. They can collect money into a float account at specific times a day because it's all real time. They can later sweep those monies to their preferred destination account again at different times a day, at any time of day that they want to be able to do that. Merchants suddenly have more control over the array of applications or processing capability that they have, and they can improve the customer experience and their operations through customizing those account-to-account flows based on when they want to do it, not dictated by when the settlement file needs to go. They're in the driver's seat. Direct connectivity to the NPP also means we can provide our customers with an absolute best-in-class service. It means we have a huge control over the journey, and as a payment solutions provider, we're not only simply a pass-through conduit, so we're not catching a file from someone and passing it through and relying then on third parties for updates. We are the people who are providing the updates. We're able to have a seat, as I mentioned before, at the NPP operating table, and we are directly plugged into the rails, which means we're the master of our own destiny in a lot of ways. We can detect issues in real time on the network and pass those issues in real time to our merchants, who importantly can make really important business decisions. Do they process? Do they not process? Do they put forward a different form of payment? Even simple things like insufficient funds on bank accounts. We can tell a merchant in real time that there's no money in that bank account for them to hit. And then they can look at how they alter that journey for a customer, just improving the experience for them, removing operational load, and being able to, process that payment by looking at alternative measures. And through all of this technology that we've been able to develop through being a CI and a BECS and an AusPayNet Tier 2, we're able to uniquely customize solutions for our Pacific business partners and for Pacific use cases and verticals. So what did it take to become a CI? So this is a really simple visualization of the different steps we had to go through to becoming a CI. I'd like to temper this by saying it is nowhere near representative of the amount of work that went in, but from a time perspective, let me quickly just summarize what we had through. So from a groundwork perspective, we had to prepare and submit an application to become a CI, which is not an easy undertaking for any organization. And that needed to be reviewed by the NPP Governance Committee as a starting point to get a green light to move forward. It was broken up into kind of 3 packages, which was business details, insurances, our 3-year plan as an organisation, our audited financials, and our projected financials and projected volumes, our operational plans, our support plans, and our incident management plans and framework. All of those components are really important, as for the operating committee to approve a partner to come on board, they're not going to do that very lightly. They want to make sure the partner is a robust business, is going to be there for the longer term, has the right processes, and really importantly, can protect the network. And that's the important part here, that they're able to protect the network and hold the network to the highest possible standards, which is where we want the NPP to be. Once that's done, we had to prepare and submit a high-level project plan. Then we moved into the next phase of the project, which is around the global connections. So we had to join SWIFT and become a new BIC. We had to prepare the topography for the NPPA and the SWIFT review. So basically it's SWIFT then looking at reviewing us and making sure we're the right partner to be able to have a server and have that physical server installed. We had to research, select, and establish all the contracts with at least 2 geographically distinct data centers. And so that is having a primary and a backup. Obviously, with physical servers, there is the possibility that they can go down. So you need to have contingency. And then we also had to research, select, and establish contracts with at least 2 global telco companies, again, to have a primary and a secondary from a backup perspective. We then moved into the internal facilitation of it. So it was all around developing, testing, and iterating on Pay2 functionality within our applications. That's the build on our side. the wonderful world of UAT, so comprehensive UAT, redundancy, disaster scenario testing, making sure that we had resiliency and we were ready to be able to do what was needed at scale as we looked at our growth objectives. And then doing buddy testing was the last component of that. The last piece we had to stare into, which was a very exciting piece for us, was then going live. So that's going through the final sign-off from Swift and from the NPPA, launching, monitoring, and adjusting the work that we had undertaken. It was, as I said at the start, it's a very simple way of describing the steps that we went through as an organisation. It was a very worthwhile exercise for us, but pleased to say that being a CI has so much benefits, not only just for ourselves as an organisation, but also for the ecosystem, but then also for our merchant partners. And for me, what I think is quite fantastic about it is, you know, we are looked at across the ecosystem as the North Star, especially across a lot of our competitors who look at us with envy that we've actually stepped into this and delivered this outcome. And I'd like to go back to my original point of falling out of an airplane, that all of this was able to be delivered from 4 guys who originally threw people out of an airplane for a living, who then now stared into solving a pretty big payments problem. Moving on to another meaty topic is around navigating ISO. ISO and ISO certification is something that's critically important for payments in the payments ecosystem. It's essentially, for anyone who doesn't understand what the ISO is, it's a single standardization approach. It's a methodology, process, and repository to be used by all financial standards initiatives. It's an open global standard for financial information. The idea of it is to provide a common language of rich and structured data that can be used for every kind of financial business transaction. Think about it as always like a common, I mentioned before, common language. It's a translation that if everybody uses the same common language, it can be ingested by other parties when they're making decisions, ingesting data, processing payments. ISO 20022 is a multi-party international standard prepared by the ISO Technical Committee and Financial Services. The objective of it, as I mentioned just previously, is to enable a communication interoperability between financial institutions, between their market infrastructures and their end user communities. It's something that hadn't been undertaken before, like globally, and it's a really important initiative that's driving across the ecosystem. It describes a common platform for the developing of messaging using a modeling methodology to capture a syntax-based independent way of financial business areas, business transactions, and associated message flows. It's a central dictionary of business items used in financial communications. It's a set of XML and ASN 1.1 design rules to convert the message models into XML or ASN.1 schemas, wherever the use of ISO 20022 XML ASN.1 base syntax is preferred. ISO enables rich, better, and more granular data end-to-end to be carried in the payments message. Better data means better decisions. Better data means more educated decisions. More data means we can make better fraud and risk decisions based on what we're receiving within that payment instruction. It also means greater success rates for those payments as well. I like to think about it as in the better quality in, the better quality out. So better quality data means better quality payments. More transparency and more remittance information for our customers, which in turn means better service and a better customer experience. It drives better and improved analytics and less manual intervention into the flow. It drives further operational benefits downstream, which is improved analytics, less manual intervention, as I mentioned before, more accurate compliance processes, and higher resilience and improved fraud prevention measures. It supports end-to-end automation. It's a single standard that covers all business domains and end-to-end business processes, and it facilitates the creation of new services and enhanced straight-through processing. And what's really important here, it's actually a modern technology. It's using mainstream XML technology, which is well supported and which also facilitates efficient integration. And the piece that I mentioned earlier, which again is just so supported here, is the worldwide adoption of it as a standard. We've got almost 200 market infrastructure driven initiatives across the world that are either currently implementing ISO or are considering adopting the standard for payments and security transformation projects. And so the more markets that jump on board with this over time, the more it will drive mainstream adoption. And as an ecosystem, we're all going to benefit from that, meaning as a payments ecosystem, and end consumers and merchants will be the net beneficiary of it. So that was ISO 20022. You've then got ISO IEC 27001. And that is as you mentioned, security, cybersecurity, and privacy protection management system. It is the world's best known standard for information security management, and it defines requirements that any ISMS must meet. The process for companies of any size, of any sectors, activity for guidance to apply for this is a guidance for establishing and implementing and maintaining and continually improving the information and management system of our ecosystem. What's really important about ISO and IEC 27001 is it's a standard that is held at the highest bar to protect the information that is captured by financial institutions when processing payments. Basically, any organisation that conforms with it means that they have put in place systems to manage risk related to the security of data or handled by the company that the system the system respects, and that best practices and principles are enshrined, linked to that standard and embedded across the organisation. The huge benefits of this ISO application for information security is quite immense, and I'll just summarize a few of them for reference on this call. Resilience to cyber attacks, preparedness for new threats. It's a data security, confidentiality, and availability of the platform. Security across all aspects and organizational-wide protection. And lastly, cost savings by really being able to minimize the impact across the ecosystem. We at Zepto both, I have ISO, we support ISO 20022, and we also have ISO IEC 27001 certification, and we're very proud to hold those two certifications and standards as core to what we deliver across our NPP services. When I look, just changing tack a little bit, I know I've gone through some pretty heavy pieces. I just wanted to talk really quickly around when I covered off these components. Here's just a couple of summarizing components of what it means from ISO IEC 27001. From a commercial standpoint, we looked at it as in being compliant to the entire requirements, not just part thereof. Some organizations that step into this ISO requirement don't step into it in totality. We saw the huge benefit of staring into this requirement in totality, and so we wholly solely stared into this across all of our aspects of the organization. ISO was not pursued for the sake of it. We built it as part of our core business program that we delivered. When we looked at scope and approach, rather than zeroing in on narrow components of the actual piece, we put everything into scope, and we tackled the technology in a holistic end-to-end mindset. And we believe that that approach was the right approach for us. One, it was less complex to actually do rather than try to piecemeal it, but the benefits of it longer term were quite significant, we saw, for ourselves, the ecosystem, and our merchant partners. Lastly, from a team and tech perspective, we looked at it as we built our foundational elements of staring into ISO was built on automation. The more we could automate the process to managing and implementing it rather than relying on individuals to do it, in two ways we really saw that as a huge benefit. One, there's less dependency on human error. There's also less dependency on resource. Having the right checks and balances is critical to make sure that that's running smoothly, which we're pleased that we have that in place. But also it's a mindset change for us as an organization when we stared into it. as Zepto, we engage with multiple world-class tech vendors to implement and satisfy the controls. So we looked at partnering with the right organisations that could bolster our organisation in relation to the application of this standard. And we've been able to partner with some serious organisations to be able to help us through that journey, which was a great learning experience for us as a business. We build compliance through being secure and implementing these controls. So through the adoption of these controls, we've built and strengthened our compliance function and uplifted that capability across the organisation. And the important point there highlighted in green is we've leveraged technology and automated to remove the operational costs. So it's not a burden for us to apply this. It's actually been a benefit for the organisation in how we've done it. I'm going to move to a topic that isn't as quite as detailed and heavy as what I've just gone through, but I think is critically important when we shift the focus and talk about the NPP. Real-time payment fraud and liability is a really key component to driving trust, merchant adoption, and consumer adoption across the NPP. The challenges I raised earlier across NPP from a fraud perspective are real. There's as NPP and real-time payments is a new payment method, the challenge that exists in the marketplace is around consumer protection and liability ultimately when something goes wrong. So when you think about fraud in what you call legacy payment types, in credit card land, when a consumer can recall a payment made in error, or on the BECS system, which is the old direct entry clearing system, which is what you've probably experienced if you've paid your energy bill and you've got a direct debit set up that's not on Pay2 or PayID. If you make that payment in error, or an organisation makes that payment in error, because that payment takes T2 or T3 days to clear, that payment can be recalled, payment can be cancelled, payment can be changed. In a real-time world, that doesn't exist. Credit card's similar. You put through a credit card payment, or a credit card payment pops up on your statement that you go, hang on, that wasn't me. You can put in a chargeback. In NPP world, once the money's gone, the money's gone. And they're irrevocable. Once the money leaves, the money leaves. And so fraud reduction and the thinking of fraud reduction and the applicability of liability considerations are really key on the NPP. There are fraud reduction capabilities in the NPP. So there are safeguard payments with advanced stressing and account validation rules. You may have heard about things on the NPP at the moment around you can check the recipient that you're sending money through if you're sending that through an ID check service. So if you're doing that through, say, some of the banks are offering that service today. So that's an account validation that is in play today. There's confirmation of payee, similar service, which provides a layer of protection for payments via BSB and account numbers, where you're checking that it's the right person. It's not someone pretending to be someone else. And that's to help protect Australians against scams and frauds and mistaken payments. There's real-time information that comes back associated to those payments. And so the good news about that is you can hit that account doesn't come back with the right information. You don't have to send the money. There can be rules by the merchant or rules by the consumer not to do it. However, all of those taken into account, there's even the most secure capabilities that we have, and some of the most banked-in capability won't stop all unauthorized fraud or social engineering scams. We're seeing a rise in that across all payment methods in Australia at the moment. People pretending to be organisations, people pretending to be family members, people pretending to be charities, trying to secure monies from people. And so this is where consumer education remains the most important preventable tool available. Consumers would therefore only initiate real-time payments to trusted recipients. And as I like to say to anyone in my family or friend circle, if ever in doubt, just don't say yes. Just don't process the payment and look into it more. When we think about risk and liability, the consumer protection piece offered by the card schemes, so credit cards and the like, it's huge at the moment. It's really trusted, it's known, it's a clear process in what happens when, and it's clearly articulated. It's readily understood and it's really valuable to consumers. So a good example, which is very topical, last year we had Bonza collapse. We had a bunch of impacted customers, not us as an organisation, but the ecosystem who had purchased flights with a credit card. Those customers could actually go back to their issuing bank and put forward what is called a credit card chargeback. where those customers could get their monies back as that service wasn't facilitated. Today on the NPP, there's no clear equivalent pay-by-bank transaction coverage. So there's no intermediary or scheme, so to speak, like Visa or MasterCard, to step in that customers can rely upon if the merchant doesn't refund, replace the purchase, or facilitate the purchase for the consumer. And so that is the major piece of what we're working through as an ecosystem at the moment. Today, I think Pay by Bank has a real great application outside of that example in travel of what I call everyday transactions people make. And that is payments on utilities, telco, gym payments, kids sport, registrations, or subscriptions. It's really those kind of billing requirements that a customer has rarely likely to submit a chargeback. You're never really going to have a problem with those transactions, as it is a relatively set and forget, other than when you want to cancel it. That's where the NPP is gaining some traction at the moment, and where it will continually scale. Until that consumer protection piece is worked through, I won't see the NPP scale to the same capability as credit cards. But once that consumer protection piece becomes clearer, I believe you're going to see a greater shift of other mainstream, what you will classify as mainstream transactions. That said, I think we've got to think a little bit more robustly as an industry where liability sits, who actually ultimately owns that liability. And that's really what the big issue is at the moment. There are some bold moves being taken around the world to try to resolve this matter, because this is an Australian-only problem. This problem's being resolved in other matters, in other markets and jurisdictions where account-to-account payments are being considered or are currently in play. Look, I don't agree with some of the emerging consumer protection regimes. It's a conversation for another time, but with what's been happening in the UK, for example, where it's all pushing it onto the banks, I think there's a middle ground here. But as I said, that's something to talk about on another time. If I flip it back to us at Zepto, we're encouraging the vision and the commitment for Pay by Bank for Zepto customers. We're continuing to support the ones that we do, like Amazon, who have stepped into this space recently with Pay2 being available in the Amazon checkout, which is huge. Red Energy, which is the first Australian institutional biller to go live with Pay2 powered by us, and the Woolworths Group, otherwise known as WPay, who have strategically embraced it. And there's a host of others that we power here in market, but there's a huge force here of customers that are really staring into NPP and looking at it as a real opportunity. So, BECSIT. So this is a Zeptoism, the term BECSIT. BECS is the legacy payment infrastructure that we have in place today. So what is BECS? You've all used BECS. I will be very surprised if everybody on this call has not used BECS in one way, shape, or form. BECS is what you call direct entry, and I mentioned it earlier in my presentation. Essentially, what BECS is the old account-to-account system is probably the best way to describe it. It is batch payments. You wanted to pay your energy bill, and you wanted to go into a direct debit arrangement with your energy provider, your golf club membership, your gym membership, and they offered you a bank account option. That bank account option is powered by BECS. Why BECS is not fit for purpose anymore? It was not immediate. It was not very data rich. It was very basic in the way that it worked. So you sent through a batch file. That batch file would process only twice a day, sometimes once a day. So it'd be morning and afternoon runs. And when you submitted the money, being the merchant, you had no visibility on whether or not that money landed. None whatsoever. You did not know if it had been received. You didn't know if they'd processed it for at least 2 to 3 days. On the merchant side, the merchant wouldn't even know if the monies were actually there to pull, and they wouldn't know if the transaction was successful again for 2 to 3 days. And then if the monies weren't there, if there was some form of issue, if you got the account or BSB number wrong, a merchant would have to kick into a process to manage the customer to try to obtain the funds. And so there was a huge operational cost. So, but it's still, from an account-to-account perspective, the majority of payments that happen. So the RBA has made the decision to retire BECS. And so in 2030, which is only 5 short years away, BECS will be sunsetted, which means that all those transactions that are currently going through BECS will need to move across to the NPP. And that's about 15 trillion in account-to-account payments a year, which is a pretty big undertaking. 5 years doesn't feel like a very long time, and it's not. And if I was going to bring it into context for you all, if you all remember when Meghan and Harry got married, we're pretty much at the halfway point between where we sit today to when they got married, from today to when BECSIT takes place. So it doesn't really feel like that long ago, and it's a huge industry shift that'll happen. We are at the forefront of managing and supporting our customers making that transition, and you could probably appreciate it's a huge undertaking for the overall industry. But to move to a digital first, always on, world-class payments ecosystem, making this change is really important to move people off that legacy system. And so we're staring into that. If you look at what visually a way of looking at what NPP versus direct entry, so at the top is direct entry payments. This is the number of transactions in millions. The next one down is just the growth of NPP. And you can really see that NPP hockey stick start to grow. I think as we move into the back half of this current physical year, you're going to start to see that moving at pace. With the likes of Amazon now offering Pay2, that'll start to drive more consumer awareness. Red Energy starting to process more payments. That'll move more institutional billers across to looking at Pay2 as a viable option. So over the next, I would say 12 months, we're going to start to see that NPP hockey stick really grow as people start to stare into that BECSIT story and that BECSIT transition. So what's next? So Payday Super. Touching on it really quickly, these are a couple of big moments that are really going to start to drive adoption across the NPP. So from a Payday Super perspective, what that change is coming in July 1 next year, and what that change is the requirement for an individual to be paid their superannuation within 7 days of when they receive their payroll. At the moment, there is no requirement for that, and it takes up to sometimes a couple of months. Can be 1, can be 2, can be 3 months in some cases where people receive their superannuation payment into their super account. So there's a push there to push all of that via what's called Payday Super, which is within 7 days of payment. Why that's an important milestone for the NPP is there's no other facility in the country that could process it within 7 days other than the NPP. Because if you have an error, you could not process it through BECS due to the T2 and T3 timeline. So that's coming midway through next year. Liability framework, this is still very much evolving, but we're working closely with Australian Payments Plus and the NPP committees to be able to land on a liability framework that supports growth and supports the consumer the way it should, and all the participants across the ecosystem. We're expecting to have more on that this year. Moving more into mainstream consumer channels. I mentioned Amazon before, and there's also Chemist Warehouse, probably the other one to call out in Pay2 land. Those merchants that are more mainstream consumer purchasers, the more of those that start to stare into the capability of NPP will really drive that next iteration of connection across the ecosystem and consumer adoption, and move others that is maybe sitting on the fence watching others to step into this technology. And lastly, which I just touched on, is migrating NPP due to BECSIT. That will be a huge undertaking for the industry, and we'll start to see over the next couple of years that migration and that hockey stick, as I mentioned, of payments and payments transactions going into the NPP. Well, there's a lot in that presentation. I'd firstly like to say thank you to every person who's decided to join me for this session, and thanks to the team at ACS for giving me the opportunity to talk. I think we move to Q&A. Before I do, there's a QR code just here for you to scan. Anyone that would like access to the presentation, you can scan that QR code and download it from a landing page that we've spun up at Zepto. It doesn't matter if you don't get time to quickly scan it or your phone's not working, because the ACS team are going to send out that QR in their communication post this session, so you'll be able to do it at your leisure on another time. So again, thank you for the opportunity. I think I'm going to hang on the line for a little bit of Q&A now, and I might hand back to the team at ACS to manage that.
Excellent. Thank you, Colin. Yeah, and I will iterate that we will send the link to Colin's presentation, as well as a link to the recording of the webinar to those that are online. There's a question that's come in through the chat about how has the introduction of NPP affected small businesses and startups in Australia, particularly in terms of cash flow management and customer satisfaction?
Oh, that is a great question. I'd say there's two considerations for a small business in relation to the NPP today. There's not a lot of small businesses on the NPP at the moment. I'd say there's a small percentage who are actually directly using it. From a cash flow perspective, it's hugely beneficial for a small business. You think about the difference of getting those monies immediately from people who are owing you money. I mean, it changes those terms around 30 days and 60-day payment terms to being able to drive them immediately. So that's a huge benefit for small businesses, and they've certainly seen some use cases of that starting to drive good upside for them. I think the other component for small businesses is understanding if the money's there. When they're pushing out the request for payment, it's really understanding whether or not the money's in someone's account. So can I pull it? Or if not, what do I do next? So there is a great benefit there. To taper that a little bit, the only area of consideration for a small business, and this will change in time, is at the moment from a cost perspective, the NPP is more expensive than the legacy direct entry rails. It'll drop in time as volume goes through it, but it is a little bit more costly on a transaction by transaction perspective, but still cheaper than credit cards and other forms of payment.
I think you've already covered this one, but one of the participants would like to know what the impacts might be on non-financial organisations.
On non-financial organisations for processing payments on the NPP?
Yeah, I think you have covered it with some of those in your last answer.
Yeah.
The impacts of BECSIT, that is.
That's
on non-financial. As a bit of a clarification.
Okay, so just repeat that question for me, please.
So they're asking what the impact of BECSIT, your term, is on non-financial organisations.
So I would look at that as, say, merchants, right? How's BECSIT going to impact merchants? Because that's a non-financial institution. They're the people who are using BECS today. Yeah, perfect. Yep, said yes. I'd say it's a huge impact to those businesses, depending on the size and the scale of the businesses. Andrew, if that was your question, the bigger the organisation, the more complex it is to migrate their current payment base from BECS over to the NPP. So it is a pretty significant undertaking for large enterprise level organisations. Think about your big billers like your Telstras, your AGLs, government transactions. It's a pretty big undertaking for them. There are tools and ways that we support those businesses in how to migrate those customers across the two. And so it's definitely an impact to them. But I say to enterprise businesses, you want to stare into that conversation now, because it's going to happen. The more time you invest into it, the lesser that challenge is to solve. The less time you leave yourself, the bigger that problem is to solve. As you step down, the problem gets somewhat smaller, as in the amount of volume you're moving across, but it also impacts right across the ecosystem, because if you go medium-sized organisations, it's complex for them because they don't have the resourcing of larger organisations to do it. So it is quite impactful across the whole ecosystem. But that's what we live and breathe as an organisation. So we stare into those problems with our customers to be able to solve it, Andrew.
So we're running out of time. So I just have one question, but the other questions we will try and get addressed. What's next for Zepto, from a business that's gone from skydivers to this very amazing outlay? What's next for you and your business?
That's a great question. We're going to continue our journey of being problem solving at the core. For us in the short term, it's grappling with improvements on the NPP to really drive NPP adoption across the market and staring to those opportunities. And we'll be building, and you'll watch this space, some very innovative products to support our merchants on activating new channels in the NPP. So I won't give too much more, but watch this space, and please follow us in our newsletter to hear more about what we're doing across product innovation in the marketplace. And then the sky's the limit for us. You'd probably say the bigger question will be, will we remain domestic, or will we move into other markets at some point in time? I'm hoping that it'll be at a point in time we'll look at where we want to play more globally and not just be a player within the Australian ecosystem, and start to look at how we can take our products and services and implement them into other markets, into other account-to-account ecosystems. So watch this space for us. No more airplanes.
It sounds as though what you're doing is quite risky anyway as well, but that's probably a conversation for another time. Anyway, thank you. Please join me in thanking Colin. We will send out that link. Sounds like you should subscribe to the newsletter, and I'm sure you can get in contact with Colin through LinkedIn or through the link there too as well. So thank you for joining me, and we look forward to seeing you next time.
Thank you, everybody.